You know, friend, there's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from standing in two worlds and belonging to neither. Most folks, they get born into one way of thinking, one way of being, and they never have to question where they fit. But some souls get caught in the space between, where the wind cuts coldest and the shadows run deepest. This here's a story about such a man. A story about blood calling to blood, and what happens when a man's got two different kinds of blood running through his veins, blood that's been spilled by both sides for both sides and against both sides more times than anyone cares to count. They called him Two Hawk, though that wasn't the name his Apache mother whispered to him as a baby, and it sure as hell wasn't the name on the papers the army carried. But names, like loyalties, can be slippery things out here in the territory. What matters isn't what you're called, it's what you're willing to do when the chips are down and the devil's dealing the cards. This story takes place in the autumn of 1885, when the leaves were turning gold in the high country and the air carried the sharp bite that warned of winter coming hard and fast. The place was the Dragoon Mountains of Arizona Territory, where the rocks run red as old blood, and the silence between the peaks can drive a man half mad with listening. But this silence was about to be broken in ways that would echo through those mountains for generations to come. The morning mist was still clinging to the juniper trees when Two Hawk crested the ridge above Fort Bowie, leading his horse on foot to keep the hoofbeats from carrying in the thin air. Below him, the military outpost spread out like a chessboard, neat rows of adobe buildings, soldiers moving in their predictable patterns, smoke rising straight up from chimneys in the still dawn air. He'd been riding hard for 3 days, carrying news that felt like a stone in his gut, news that would set events in motion he couldn't stop, couldn't change, couldn't do anything about except watch and choose which side he'd stand with when the blood started flowing. Two Hawk was a tall man, lean as a whip and twice as tough, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of too many years under the desert sun. His hair was black as a raven's wing, worn long in the Apache way, but tied back practical-like for riding. His eyes were grey, his father's eyes, the only thing the white man had left him besides a name he'd never use, and a heritage that fit him about as well as a rope around his neck. He wore white man's clothes, mostly canvas pants, cotton shirt, leather vest, but his moccasins were Apache-made, and the turquoise and silver bracelet on his wrist had been his mother's. Everything about him spoke of a man caught between worlds, trying to make peace with pieces that didn't quite fit together. 28 years he'd been walking this line, serving as a scout for the army while his mother's people called him traitor, helping the cavalry track Apache raiders while knowing some of those raiders might be his own bloodkin. It was a job that paid decent and kept him useful to both sides, but it was also slowly eating away at his soul like acid on metal. As he made his way down toward the fort, Two Hawk's mind went back 3 days, to the hidden canyon where he'd met with Spotted Wolf, war chief of a small band of Chiricahua Apache who'd been raiding settlements along the Mexico border. Spotted Wolf was Two Hawk's mother's brother, his uncle, though they'd only met a handful of times over the years. The war chief was a hard man, made harder by watching his people driven from their ancestral lands, herded onto reservations like cattle, forced to farm ground that wouldn't grow anything but bitterness and resentment. "Nephew," Spotted Wolf had said, using the Apache words that felt both familiar and foreign in Two Hawk's ears. "The time for choosing is coming. Soon we ride against the White Eyes town, the place they call Willcox." Two Hawk had felt his blood turn cold. Willcox was a railroad town, maybe 300 souls, including women and children. It had a small garrison, but nothing that could stand against a coordinated Apache attack. Why Willcox, he'd asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. Spotted Wolf's face had been stone, but his eyes burned with the fire of old wounds. "Because they killed my son. My boy, barely 16 summers, shot down like a dog while trying to trade horses. The soldiers said he was stealing. The traders said he threatened them. All lies. My son spoke their tongue, knew their ways. He was trying to make peace." The war chief had stood then, his weathered frame still carrying the strength that had made him feared from the Gila River to the Sierra Madre. 20 warriors ride with me. We strike in 5 days when the moon is dark. The railroad brings gold through there, and guns, and the supplies that feed the soldiers who hunt our people. We take it all, burn what we cannot carry, and let the White Eyes know that Apache blood demands Apache justice. Two Hawk had tried to argue, tried to find another way, but Spotted Wolf's mind was set like iron. The raid would happen. The only question was how many would die when it did. Now, 3 days later, Two Hawk was bringing that news to Fort Bowie, to Colonel Morrison, who'd trusted him for 5 years, who'd treated him fair when fair was a rare commodity for a half-breed in army ranks. The guard at the gate recognized him and waved him through without challenge. Two Hawk had ridden this path too many times to count, bringing intelligence about Apache movements, helping the cavalry stay one step ahead of raids and ambushes. But this time felt different. This time he wasn't just carrying information, he was carrying the weight of what was about to happen and the knowledge that his words would determine who lived and who died when the shooting started. Colonel Morrison was in his office, bent over maps and reports, his grey hair catching the morning light streaming through the window. He was a good soldier, as fair as the circumstances allowed, but he was still a white man in a white man's army, fighting what he saw as a white man's war. Two Hawk, Morrison said without looking up. You look like a man with bad news. Spotted Wolf is gathering warriors, Two Hawk said, getting straight to the point. They're planning to hit Willcox in 2 days. That got Morrison's attention. His head snapped up, blue eyes sharp as winter ice. How many? 20, maybe 25 fighters. They want the railroad gold and the supply wagons. Morrison was already moving, calling for his aide, reaching for his hat. How good is your information? Two Hawk met his eyes steadily. Blood good, Colonel. Family good. Morrison paused at that, understanding the weight of what Two Hawk was saying. The scout wasn't just reporting on strangers, he was betraying his own kin. I can have 2 companies of cavalry in Willcox by tomorrow night, Morrison said, thinking out loud. Set up an ambush, catch them in a crossfire when they come in. That's a lot of good men who'll die, Two Hawk said quietly. Morrison's face hardened. Apache warriors who chose to go on the warpath. They know the risks. I wasn't talking about the Apache. Long pause, let the implication hang heavy. Morrison studied Two Hawk for a long moment, seeing something in the scout's face that he'd never noticed before, or maybe seeing it clearly for the first time. You're thinking there's another way to handle this? Two Hawk nodded slowly. Maybe, but it would mean trusting me to do something that might not make sense to you, might not look like the right thing from where you're standing. What kind of something? The kind that might save lives on both sides, but would require you to hold your cavalry back and let me try to stop this thing before it starts. Morrison walked to the window, looking out at the parade ground where soldiers were drilling in the morning sun. Young men, most of them, who'd signed up for adventure and found themselves hunting ghosts through the desert, fighting an enemy they didn't understand for reasons they couldn't always remember. You know, Morrison said finally, there's been talk. Some of the other officers think maybe I trust you too much. Think maybe a half-breed's loyalty is always going to be divided. Two Hawk felt something cold settle in his chest. And what do you think, Colonel? Morrison turned from the window, and when he met Two Hawk's eyes, there was something like understanding there. I think a man's loyalty isn't about the color of his skin or the blood in his veins. It's about the choices he makes when the chips are down. He paused, making his own choice. You've got 24 hours. After that, I send the cavalry, and whatever happens, happens. Two Hawk nodded and turned to go, but Morrison's voice stopped him at the door. Two Hawk, whatever you're planning, be careful. Both sides have good reasons to want you dead if this goes wrong. As Two Hawk rode out of Fort Bowie, heading back into the high country, he carried with him the weight of Morrison's trust and the knowledge that he was about to attempt something that had never been done before in all the years of fighting between the army and the Apache. He was going to try to make peace, real peace, the kind that required both sides to see past their hatred and their fear, past the blood that had been spilled and the wrongs that had been done, to something deeper and more lasting. But first, he had to survive long enough to try. The ride back into Apache country took him through terrain that felt like riding through his own divided soul, past the places where his Apache mother had taught him to read, sign and track game, past the spots where his cavalry patrols had fought running battles with Apache raiders. Every mile carried memories, and every memory carried the weight of choices made and unmade. As the sun climbed toward noon, Two Hawk found himself thinking about his mother, Yellow Bird Woman, who died of fever when he was 16. She'd been caught between worlds, too, an Apache woman who'd married a white trader who'd tried to raise a son to survive in both cultures. Remember, she'd told him near the end, when the fever was burning bright in her eyes, you carry the best of both peoples in your heart. Someday that burden will become a gift, but only if you're brave enough to use it. Now, riding toward a confrontation that could end with him dead at the hands of either side, Two Hawk wondered if this was what she'd meant. If this moment, balanced on the knife's edge between war and peace, was what his whole divided life had been preparing him for. The question was, would he be brave enough to find out? The Apache camp sat in a natural amphitheater of red stone, hidden so well that a man could ride within 100 yards and never know it was there. Two Hawk approached on foot, having left his horse tied in a grove of oak trees a quarter-mile back. This was the kind of place where showing up mounted could be mistaken for an attack, and mistakes in Apache country had a way of ending permanently. He'd painted his face with clay and ochre in the old way, following patterns his mother had taught him, and removed his cavalry-issued clothing for traditional Apache dress, buckskin leggings, cotton shirt, and a red headband that marked him as kin. But he still felt like a stranger approaching home, uncertain of his welcome. The first sentry he encountered was barely out of boyhood, maybe 17, with eager eyes and a new rifle he probably didn't know how to use properly. The boy recognized him, though blood calls to blood, even across years and choices. Two Hawk who rides with soldiers, the young warrior said, using the formal Apache name that marked both recognition and distrust. I come to speak with Spotted Wolf, Two Hawk replied in the old tongue, the words feeling both familiar and rusty in his mouth. He said you would come. He said you would try to stop us. The boy's hand moved closer to his rifle. He said I should watch you carefully. Two Hawk nodded, understanding. Trust was a luxury the Apache couldn't afford, especially not with someone who served their enemies. But family was family, and Apache law demanded that blood relatives be heard, even when their words might bring pain. The camp itself was a study in controlled tension. 23 warriors he counted, plus a handful of women and children who'd been brought along to tend horses and prepare food. These weren't the reservation Apache, soft from government rations and broken by defeat. These were the old ones, the free ones, who'd chosen the hard path of resistance over the slow death of surrender. Spotted Wolf sat near the central fire, working on his weapons with the methodical care of a man who knew his life depended on their reliability. He was a compact man, built like a mountain cat, with scars that told stories of a dozen battles with cavalry, Mexican federales and rival tribes. When he saw Two Hawk approaching, he didn't look up from his work. My sister's son comes to plead for his white friends, Spotted Wolf said, his voice carrying across the camp loud enough for everyone to hear. He comes to ask us to forget our dead, to swallow our pride, to let the killers of children sleep safe in their beds. Two Hawk stopped at the edge of the firelight, knowing that every warrior in the camp was watching, listening, measuring. What he said here would determine not just whether he lived to see another sunset, but whether there was any chance of stopping the bloodbath that was coming. I come because I've seen what happens when the shooting starts, he said, pitching his voice to carry. I've seen Apache warriors die in cavalry ambushes. I've seen soldiers cut down in raids. I've seen children from both sides grow up without fathers, and mothers from both sides bury their sons. Spotted Wolf finally looked up, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight like chips of obsidian. And what would my sister's son have us do? Submit to the reservation, let them cage us like animals, take our weapons, forbid our ceremonies, force our children to speak only the white man's tongue? I would have you choose your battles wisely, Two Hawk replied. Willcox has cavalry protection now. The army knows you're coming. This won't be a raid, it will be a trap. A murmur ran through the assembled warriors. Some looked surprised, others angry. A few looked thoughtful. How do they know? Asked Red Cloud, Spotted Wolf's lieutenant, a man with ritual scars on his cheeks and the wary eyes of a lifelong fighter. Two Hawk met his gaze steadily. Because I told them. The silence that followed was profound, dangerous. Hands moved to weapons, bodies tensed for violence. In that moment, Two Hawk was balanced on the edge of a blade, and everyone present knew it. But Spotted Wolf held up a hand, and the tension eased slightly, though it didn't disappear. At least you have the courage to speak the truth, the war chief said. Tell me, nephew, why do you betray your mother's people to save your father's? I don't, Two Hawk said simply. I betray no one to save everyone. He stepped closer to the fire, knowing that proximity made him both more vulnerable and harder to ignore. You want to strike at Willcox because they killed your son. The soldiers want to hunt you because you've been raiding their supply lines. Both sides have blood debts to collect, and both sides think the only way to get justice is through more killing. Because it is the only way, Red Cloud said harshly. The White Eyes understand nothing but force. Show weakness, and they take everything. Show strength, and they negotiate. Show strength, yes, Two Hawk agreed. But what kind of strength? The strength that comes from killing enemies, or the strength that comes from making enemies into allies? Spotted Wolf leaned forward, his scarred face intent. Speak plainly, nephew. What are you proposing? Two Hawk took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to suggest would sound like madness to warriors who'd been fighting for their survival since childhood. I'm proposing that you ride to Willcox, not to attack it, but to defend it. The explosion of angry voices was immediate. Warriors surged to their feet, hands reaching for guns and knives. Only Spotted Wolf's sharp command kept them from action, but barely. Have you lost your mind? Red Cloud demanded. Defend the place we planned to raid. Help our enemies. Help everyone, Two Hawk said, raising his voice over the angry muttering. There's a larger band of renegades coming, Mexicans and American outlaws, maybe 30 or 40 strong. They know about the railroad gold, know about the supply wagons. They plan to hit Willcox tomorrow night, same as you. This was the gamble, the lie that wasn't quite a lie. There were outlaws operating along the border. There always were, and they did hit railroad towns when the opportunity presented itself. What Two Hawk was counting on was that his reputation for honesty would sell a story that was true in spirit, if not in specific detail. Spotted Wolf studied his nephew's face with the intensity of a man trying to read tracks in difficult ground. And you know this how? Because I scout for the army. Because I know the outlaw trails, as well as I know the Apache ones. Because I've seen the signs. Two Hawk met his uncle's eyes steadily. They'll come in hard and fast, kill everyone in sight, take what they want, and disappear back across the border. And when they do, who do you think the army will blame? The logic was inescapable, and Spotted Wolf knew it. Apache raiders were always the first suspects when frontier towns got hit. Didn't matter if they were actually responsible or not. So you want us to fight alongside the cavalry that has been hunting us, Spotted Wolf said slowly. Fight to protect the town we plan to raid. I want you to show the White Eyes that Apache warriors are not their enemies unless they choose to be. I want you to demonstrate that your people fight for justice, not for the love of killing. I want you to turn this from a story about savage Indians attacking innocent settlers into a story about brave Apache warriors defending American citizens from Mexican bandits." The camp fell silent as the warriors digested this. It was a crazy plan, the kind of scheme that could only work if everything went exactly right and could get them all killed if anything went wrong. But it was also potentially brilliant. "And what does the army offer in return for this assistance?" Spotted Wolf asked. Two Hawk had been hoping he wouldn't ask that question, because the answer was nothing. Morrison had given him 24 hours to prevent a massacre, not authority to negotiate treaties. "They offer the chance to be seen as something other than savages, to be exterminated," he said finally. "They offer the possibility that your sons might grow up in a world where being Apache doesn't automatically make you an outlaw." Red clouds spat into the fire, making it hiss and spark. Pretty words. But words don't feed families or protect children. Words don't keep soldiers from shooting Apache men on sight. "No," Two Hawk agreed, "but actions might. The right actions, at the right time, witnessed by the right people." He gestured toward the camp, toward the weapons and supplies that represented months of raiding and fighting. "You've spent 3 years proving you can make war, now prove you can make peace. Not submission, peace. The kind that comes from strength, not weakness." Spotted Wolf stood and walked to the edge of the firelight, looking out at the desert night where stars were beginning to appear in the clear sky. For a long time he said nothing, and the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the distant call of a coyote. When he finally turned back to face the assembled warriors, his decision was written on his face like words carved in stone. "We have fought the white man's armies for 3 years," he said, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated sorrow and pride. "We have won battles and lost friends. We have shown them that Apache warriors cannot be broken, cannot be defeated by superior numbers or better weapons." He paused, looking at each of his men in turn. "But my sister's son speaks truth. We have not shown them that we can be anything other than enemies. Perhaps it is time to demonstrate that Apache strength comes in many forms." Red Cloud stepped forward, his face troubled. "War Chief, this could be a trap. The scout could be leading us into ambush." "Yes," Spotted Wolf agreed. "It could be, and if it is, we will die fighting, as Apache warriors should. But if it is not," he looked at Two Hawk with something that might have been respect. "If it is not, then perhaps my grandson will grow up in a world where being Apache means something more than being hunted." The vote, when it came, was closer than Two Hawk had hoped, but decisive enough to matter. 15 warriors chose to follow Spotted Wolf's lead. 8, led by Red Cloud, decided to take their chances in Mexico rather than trust their lives to a plan that seemed too risky, too dependent on things beyond their control. As the camp divided and prepared for 2 different futures, Spotted Wolf pulled Two Hawk aside. "Nephew," he said quietly, "you understand what you have asked of us. If this goes wrong, if your army friends decide to treat us as enemies despite our help, my people will be caught in the open with no escape." Two Hawk nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket. "I understand, Uncle, and I understand that if I've led you wrong, my mother's spirit will never forgive me." Spotted Wolf smiled then, the first genuine smile Two Hawk had seen from him. "Your mother was always too trusting for her own good," he said. "Perhaps that is why she fell in love with a white trader, and perhaps that is why her son thinks he can make peace between peoples who have been killing each other for generations." He clapped Two Hawk on the shoulder, the gesture both blessing and burden. "Tomorrow we ride to Willcox, not as raiders but as defenders, not as enemies of the white man, but as enemies of all who would harm the innocent." As the war party prepared to move out under cover of darkness, Two Hawk found himself thinking once again about his mother's words, about carrying the best of both peoples in his heart, about burdens that could become gifts. Tomorrow would test whether Yellowbird Woman had been a prophet or just a dying woman trying to give her mixed-blood son something to hope for. Either way, there would be no turning back. The lights of Willcox looked like fallen stars scattered across the desert floor as Two Hawk crested the rise overlooking the town. Behind him, 15 Apache warriors rode in silence, their horses' hooves muffled with cloth, their weapons checked and ready for whatever the night might bring. It was just past midnight, and the town lay quiet under a moonless sky. A few windows still glowed yellow with lamplight. The saloon, the telegraph office, the depot where tomorrow's eastbound train would load water and supplies for the journey through the desert. Peaceful, ordinary, the kind of frontier town that existed in a dozen territories, home to railroad workers and ranchers, shopkeepers and drifters, all trying to carve out a piece of the American dream from unforgiving land. In 6 hours, if Two Hawk's plan worked, it would be the site of the most unlikely alliance the Arizona Territory had ever seen. If his plan failed, well, it would be another name on the long list of frontier towns that had died hard and been forgotten quickly. Colonel Morrison was waiting for them at the arranged spot, a dry wash half a mile north of town where runoff from the mountains had carved a shallow canyon into the hard earth. The colonel had brought 20 soldiers with him, including Sergeant McKenna, an Irishman who'd served with Morrison for 8 years and had the kind of steady nerves that kept men alive in tight spots. The meeting between Morrison and Spotted Wolf was like watching two different species of predator take each other's measure. Both men understood violence, respected it, had used it to survive in a world that didn't offer many alternatives. But both were also smart enough to recognize when violence wasn't the answer. "Colonel," Two Hawk said, making the introductions, "this is Spotted Wolf, War Chief of the Chiricahua Band, War Chief Colonel Morrison of the 6th Cavalry." Morrison stepped forward, his hand extended in the white man's gesture of peace. After a moment's hesitation, Spotted Wolf took it, their clasped hands bridging cultures that had been at war for generations. "Your scout tells me you're here to help defend this town," Morrison said. "I am here because my nephew believes there is honor to be found in protecting the innocent," Spotted Wolf replied in carefully pronounced English. "Whether he is right, we will learn before sunrise." Morrison nodded, understanding the conditional nature of the alliance. Trust would have to be earned, not assumed. "What do you know about these raiders?" he asked Two Hawk. This was the moment of truth, the place where Two Hawk's half-truth would either save lives or get good men killed. He'd gambled everything on the idea that his reputation for honesty would carry them through, that the larger pattern of border troubles would make his specific story believable. "Mixed band," he said, trying to project more confidence than he felt. "Americans and Mexicans, maybe some deserters from both armies. They've been hitting railroad towns along the border for months. Always come in hard and fast, always leave nothing but bodies and burned buildings." That much was true, even if the specific details about Willcox were invented. Morrison had read the reports, knew the pattern. How many? 30, maybe 40. They'll come from the south, probably split into 3 groups, hit the depot, the bank and the marshal's office all at once. Morrison studied the town below, his military mind automatically cataloguing defensive positions, fields of fire, escape routes. "We can set up overlapping fields of fire from the buildings around the main street," he said, thinking out loud. "Catch them in a crossfire when they ride in." "That will work if they come straight up the main street," Spotted Wolf said. "But raiders who have survived this long will not be so foolish. They will scout first, look for sentries, choose their approach carefully." Morrison looked at the Apache war chief with new respect. Whatever else Spotted Wolf might be, he wasn't a savage who knew only how to fight. He was a tactician, a student of warfare, who understood both strategy and human nature. "What would you do?" Morrison asked. Spotted Wolf smiled, and for a moment he looked almost approachable, like a man you might share a drink with, instead of someone you'd been hunting through the desert for 3 years. "I would let them enter the town. Let them think they have achieved surprise. Then I would hit them from 3 sides at once, front, back, and from above. Trap them in the street like fish in a net. Risky, Morrison said. If we let them get among the buildings, there's a chance of civilian casualties. There is always that chance in war, Spotted Wolf replied. But if we fight them at the edge of town in the open, some will escape. They will return with more men, bigger guns. Better to end it here tonight, completely. Two Hawk listened to the exchange with a mixture of admiration and growing dread. These men were planning a battle based on his fabricated intelligence, positioning soldiers and warriors to fight an enemy that might not even exist. If no raiders showed up, if his lie was exposed, the fragile alliance would shatter like glass. But if he was wrong about the outlaws, if there really was no threat to Willcox, then at least no one would die for his deception. The Apache warriors would return to their mountains, the soldiers would return to their fort, and maybe, just maybe, the memory of cooperation would outlast the disappointment of anticlimactic resolution. It was Sergeant McKenna who spotted them first. "Colonel," he whispered, pointing south toward a line of low hills that bordered the desert. "Movement on the ridge. Riders, maybe 20 or 25. Two Hawk felt his heart stop. There really were raiders approaching Willcox. His lie had been truth all along, or truth had made itself conform to his lie. Either way, men were about to die, and the alliance he'd forged between cavalry and Apache was about to face its first and possibly final test. Morrison raised his field glasses, studying the approaching horsemen in the faint starlight. "They're coming in from 3 directions," he said quietly, "just like you predicted. Main force from the south, smaller groups from east and west." Spotted Wolf had produced his own spyglass, undoubtedly taken from some cavalry patrol in years past, and was conducting his own reconnaissance. "Mexican sombreros," he reported. "American saddles, mixed weapons. These are not soldiers or lawmen. These are men who take what they want and kill those who resist." The 3 leaders looked at each other, and in that moment, Two Hawk saw something remarkable happen. The racial barriers, the cultural divisions, the years of warfare and mistrust, all of it fell away in the face of a common enemy and a shared purpose. "Positions?" Morrison asked. Spotted Wolf pointed to the buildings around the town's main intersection. "My warriors on the rooftops, moving position to position like shadows. Your soldiers in the buildings, covering the streets. When the shooting starts, we drive them toward the center, then finish it quickly." Morrison nodded, understanding the plan instantly. He'd fought Apache warriors for years, had learned to respect their ability to move unseen, to appear where they were least expected. "And if some of your men are mistaken for hostiles by my soldiers in the dark, then we die as warriors should." Spotted Wolf replied simply. "But we die fighting beside you, not against you. That will have to be enough." The next 2 hours passed like a slow-motion nightmare. Soldiers and Apache warriors took their positions throughout the town, moving like ghosts through streets that would soon run red with blood. Two Hawk found himself stationed on the roof of the general store, armed with a rifle and a prayer that his impossible alliance would hold together when the shooting started. Below him, the raiders had entered the town as Spotted Wolf had predicted, cautiously, professionally, splitting into 3 groups to hit multiple targets simultaneously. They were good at their work, these border wolves, and under different circumstances they might have succeeded in their raid. But they'd never faced an alliance like this before. They'd never ridden into a trap set by men who'd been fighting each other for years, but who'd temporarily found a common cause. The first shot came from the bank, where 3 raiders had tried to break in through a rear window. Sergeant McKenna's rifle spoke from across the street, and one of the outlaws spun and fell. The battle for Willcox had begun. What followed was 20 minutes of controlled chaos, as carefully laid plans met the brutal reality of close-quarters combat. The raiders, caught between cavalry carbines and Apache rifles, fought like cornered wolves. They were brave men, in their way, and they died hard. But they were outnumbered and outflanked. trapped in a kill zone that had been designed by men who understood both the white man's way of war and the Apache art of ambush. One by one they fell, until the streets of Willcox were littered with bodies and the air was thick with gun smoke and the moans of the wounded. When it was over, when the last raider had surrendered or died, Two Hawk climbed down from his rooftop perch to find Morrison and Spotted Wolf standing together in the middle of Main Street, both men still alive, both wounded but functional. "Casualties?" Morrison asked. "Two soldiers wounded, neither seriously," Sergeant McKenna reported. "The Apache, no casualties at all, sir. They fight like ghosts." Spotted Wolf nodded grimly. "We know this kind of warfare. It is what we do." As dawn broke over the Dragoon Mountains, painting the sky the color of old rose and new gold, the people of Willcox began to emerge from their homes and businesses to see what had happened in their town. What they saw changed everything. They saw cavalry soldiers and Apache warriors working together to tend the wounded and bury the dead. They saw Spotted Wolf, the war chief who'd been terrorizing the borderlands for 3 years, helping to carry supplies to injured civilians. They saw their own children, wide-eyed with wonder, watching Apache braves who treated them with gentle courtesy instead of savage violence. The story spread like wildfire, carried by telegraph wires and railroad tracks, newspaper reporters and traveling preachers. The story of the night when Apache warriors and cavalry soldiers stood together to defend an American town from Mexican raiders. The story of enemies who became allies in the service of something larger than their own grievances. It wasn't enough to end all the fighting between the army and the Apache. Too much blood had been spilled. Too many wrongs had been done on both sides for a single night's work to heal all wounds. But it was a beginning. A crack in the wall of hatred and fear that had divided two peoples for generations, a moment when warriors on both sides remembered that courage and honor weren't the exclusive property of any one race or culture. Colonel Morrison stood with Two Hawk on the ridge, overlooking Willcox, as the Apache warriors prepared to return to their mountain strongholds. The formal alliance was over. Both sides understood that. But something had changed, something that couldn't be undone by orders from Washington or demands for vengeance from Apache elders. "What happens now?" Morrison asked. Two Hawk looked out over the town where American and Apache blood had been shed in defense of innocent lives, where two cultures had briefly found common ground in the face of a common enemy. "Now we remember," he said simply. "Both sides remember that we fought together instead of against each other. We remember that Apache warriors bled to defend American civilians. We remember that Apache warriors bled to defend American civilians. We remember that cavalry soldiers trusted their lives to Apache tactics and Apache honor." Morrison nodded, understanding. Memory was a powerful thing on the frontier, where stories traveled faster than telegraph wires and lived longer than the men who made them. "And you?" Morrison asked. "What becomes of a man who stands between two worlds?" Two Hawk was quiet for a long time, watching Spotted Wolf embrace his warriors before they mounted their horses for the journey back to Apache country. The war chief caught his eye and nodded once, a gesture of respect between kinsmen who'd found their way back to each other across a gulf of blood and mistrust. "I keep standing," Two Hawk said finally. "Keep carrying messages between peoples who need to understand each other. Keep looking for the places where enemies might become something more than enemies." He touched the turquoise bracelet on his wrist, his mother's bracelet, and thought about Yellow Bird Woman's words about burdens becoming gifts. "Maybe that's what it means to be caught between two worlds," he said. "Maybe it means you're the only one who can see the bridges that others miss." As the Apache warriors disappeared into the morning haze, riding toward mountains that looked purple against the rising sun, Two Hawk made his own choice about the future. He would continue scouting for the army. His skills were too valuable to waste, and Morrison's trust was too precious to abandon. But he would also continue carrying messages to Apache bands, serving as a bridge between worlds that needed each other more than they knew. The fighting wasn't over. There would be more raids, more battles, more young men dying for causes they barely understood. But something had changed in the desert that morning, something that would echo through the years like ripples spreading across still water. You see, friend, that's the thing about standing between two worlds. It's the loneliest place a man can find himself, but it's also the place where miracles can happen, where enemies can discover they have more in common than they thought, where the worst in human nature can be transformed into something approaching the best. Two-Hawk learned that night that his mother had been right about the burden he carried. The blood of two peoples flowing through his veins wasn't a curse, it was a responsibility, a calling to stand in the spaces between cultures and help them see past their fear and hatred to the shared humanity underneath. The story of the Battle of Willcox, as it came to be known, traveled throughout the territory and beyond. Newspaper reporters from back east came to interview the participants, trying to understand how Apache warriors and cavalry soldiers had fought side by side against a common enemy. Government officials studied the incident, looking for lessons that might be applied to other conflicts. But the real impact wasn't in the newspapers or the government reports. It was in the changed attitudes of the people who'd been there, who'd seen enemies treat each other with respect and honor. It was in the Apache children who grew up hearing stories about the time their warriors defended an American town. It was in the soldiers who learned that courage and tactical skill weren't limited to any one race or culture. Most importantly, it was in the precedent it set, the proof that cooperation was possible, that the cycle of violence and revenge could be broken, that there were alternatives to the endless war that had been consuming both peoples for generations. Two-Hawk served as an army scout for 7 more years, until arthritis and old wounds forced him to retire from active duty. But he never stopped carrying messages between communities, never stopped looking for opportunities to build understanding between peoples who saw each other as enemies. He married, eventually, a schoolteacher from Tucson who understood his divided loyalties and respected his calling. They had 3 children, mixed blood like their father, who grew up speaking both English and Apache, learning the stories and traditions of both cultures. When Two-Hawk died in 1923, at the age of 66, his funeral was attended by both Apache elders and retired cavalry officers. They buried him on a hill overlooking the Dragoon Mountains, with a headstone that bore inscriptions in both languages, marking him as a bridge between worlds. But the real monument to his life wasn't carved in stone. It was carved in the hearts and minds of the people who'd learned from his example that being caught between cultures wasn't a curse. It was an opportunity to help those cultures understand each other. The moral of this story, if stories like this have morals, isn't that all conflicts can be resolved through goodwill and understanding. Some hatreds run too deep, some wounds are too fresh, some interests are too opposed for easy reconciliation. But it is a reminder that even in the darkest times, even when cultures seem locked in endless conflict, there are always individuals who can see past the divisions to the common humanity underneath. People who are willing to take risks for the possibility of peace, who are brave enough to trust their enemies, who understand that sometimes the greatest courage is found not in fighting, but in refusing to fight. Two-Hawk's story teaches us that being different doesn't have to mean being enemies, that understanding others doesn't require abandoning yourself, that sometimes the people best equipped to solve problems are those who've experienced them from both sides. In our own times, when divisions seem to be growing deeper and dialogue seems to be getting harder, we might remember the half-breed scout who chose to stand between two worlds rather than pick a side. We might ask ourselves whether we're building bridges or burning them, whether we're looking for common ground or digging deeper trenches. Because in the end, friend, we're all caught between worlds of one kind or another, between the past and the future, between our better angels and our darker impulses, between the people we are and the people we might become. The question isn't whether we'll find ourselves standing in those uncomfortable spaces between certainties. The question is what we'll do when we get there. whether we'll use our position to help others see past their differences, or whether we'll just stand there, paralyzed by the complexity of it all. Hawk chose to build bridges, to carry messages, to look for the light that exists even in the darkest conflicts. Maybe, just maybe, that's a choice we can all make. And if you ever find yourself in the Arizona desert, driving through those ancient mountains where Apache warriors once rode and cavalry soldiers once patrolled, look for a small cemetery on a hill overlooking the Dragoons. Look for a weathered headstone with words in 2 languages, marking the grave of a man who refused to choose sides in a war that everyone else thought was inevitable. Stand there for a moment, in the desert silence, and listen. You might just hear the echo of a different way forward, carried on the wind that blows between 2 worlds.